So there's a lot that goes on in post-World War II United States history. A lot of this revolves around now the U.S. being a major power in the world, no longer isolated in the world, and now taking on the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and so it's also at the head of this kind of industrial, military, technological world, which we're kind of rapidly being paced in. And if you look at some of the posters I have here, you can kind of see what's being represented. Get this thing out of here. Okay, there it goes. Uh, so I mean, you have Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X up here. So obviously, 1960s civil rights is a big deal. War in Vietnam, war in Korea earlier. So you see the Cold War play out. I guess the Korean War you would kind of say was somewhat of a success, whereas Vietnam War is really one of the first times the United States really suffered at least a loss. Then the pictures to the left, more contemporary. You have kind of the globalized aspect of the United States and McDonald's. You can find McDonald's anywhere in the world almost, it seems. So you have that globalized capitalist world that we all inhabit nowadays play out in this image. And then finally, obviously, the last 20 years have been wrapped up in this war on terror after the attacks on 9/11. So, so I'm going to break this lecture up in probably about three segments. So let me go ahead and dive right in. So there's a lot going on in this particular slide. Most of it having to do with the Cold War. So we probably spent a lot of time right here, but let me just kind of break it down. So as I mentioned, the United States is very very involved in global affairs. It has kind of taken the lead in a way that France and England used to have. Now the United States is kind of leading up this charge, um, and it's fighting what now is considered an ideological war against the Soviet Union, right? So the Soviet Union, featuring Russia. This is a country that's communist currently, right after World War II, still under the dictatorship of Joseph Stalin, and it's one party, and it's becoming more aggressive, at least in trying to control the states around it. So the United States is going to get very active, especially in protecting Western Europe, rebuilding Western Germany, and rebuilding Japan. And this is all, kind of from 1945, 1952. This is what the United States is kind of winning this ideological war this way, because, I mean, frankly, um, with the Berlin airdrop in Germany, and then even with rebuilding Japan in such a rapid pace, U.S. is kind of winning in that area. However, China becomes communist under Mao in '49, and shortly after that, Stalin gives the okay for North Korea to invade South Korea. So the Cold War begins essentially with the Korean War. Now, what do I mean by Cold War? So let me just define that really quick. Basically, it means that it's cold because neither of the big powers actually fight toe to toe. Most of the fighting, either the Soviet Union or the United States does, happens in the quote unquote third world, global south, generally speaking. But so the major powers never fight, but they'll fight against places. They'll be in Korea, they'll be in Vietnam, so you'll be in Afghanistan. But they don't directly fight. The closest the United States and Soviet Union ever come to blows is with the Cuban Missile Crisis that happens under the Kennedy administration. So the doctrine that the U.S. is going to hold for the Cold War is this idea of called containment. So, idea, well, first of all, there's the Truman Doctrine. So, Harry Truman is president. Harry Truman says like it is a job of the United States to defend the free world. So he's there to defend democracies. And the way that the United States will defend democracies is through what's called the Marshall Plan. We already kind of saw the Marshall Plan go into effect, right? The rebuilding Western Europe, the rebuilding Japan, and so the Americans are pouring money into the rebuilding project. Um, and so, but what happens when an aggressive communist country is invading a democratic country? Well, with the help of the United Nations, the U.S. intervenes. And as you are probably well aware, Korea is still split between North Korea and South Korea. That actually gets settled at the end of the Korean War. So what is the situation then is pretty much the situation now. And so this is the idea of containment. It wasn't that, the United States is going to basically take out North Korea and create one, democratic Korea, even though, they wanted to. But that wasn't the option. It wasn't the goal. The goal was just to not allow communism to spread because it was big fear. You got China now, it's communist. Obviously, Russia is communist. North Korea is communist. And this is what leads eventually to Vietnam. This idea of like, oh, great, Vietnam is going to become communist. It's this. We need to contain it. We need to contain the communism. All right, so that's a tail end of Harry Truman's time in office. Truman's a pretty big hinge character. In other words, he takes over after FDR dies, gets reelected, and is involved in the Cold War with the Korean War in particular. But I think the big thing was he also desegregated the military. So you're starting to see the civil rights movement really take shape. Right, there's a lot of activism that happens before the 1950s comes along and 1960s comes along, and it's really starting to catch up. Eisenhower, the military commander during World War II, he's president for most of the 1950s, and he's an older guy, not very ideological, so it's kind of politically a kind of a stable period. It is the era of suburbia, and the ideal of like the happy nuclear family, you see on television in those old 1950s TV show. So that's kind of the perception, at least the popular culture was giving. It's also a time of great Cold War hysteria that there's communist agents all over the U.S. and they're waiting to take over the country from behind the scenes. Anyways, the worst aspect of this is McCarthyism, where the Senator McCarthy has like a list of supposed like communist infiltrators within the Hollywood world, the military world, etc. And he's going to expose these communist agents. Nothing ever comes out from this. I mean, there's some show trials that happen, and it's pretty bananas. But ultimately, McCarthy will be exposed as a fraud, and that whole thing kind of dies off. But every now and then you kind of see these Red Scare moments in U.S. history where people's politics will be a little progressive, and people will start to label them Marxist and communist as a way to like get them to go away. The I think Eisenhower's probably most famous speech is his going away speech, actually his farewell address. That's where he talks about the military industrial complex. As a speech is totally worth listening to if you haven't done this yet. But he basically says like, look, we shouldn't be in the business of building up a defense just to like reward these fat military contracts. It's becoming really expensive and dangerous. And you can see, if you look at the defense budget, since Eisenhower, it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger every year. But he's the first to kind of say that, and it has legs. I mean, because he was the military commander during World War II of the Allied forces, so he kind of knows what he's talking about. It's under Eisenhower as well. You think about our freeway system, that the interstate highway system is really built. So it's a time of a lot of infrastructure. suburbia is coming up. This highway system is going, and so cultural wise, you get the beginning of the beat writers, people like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, to name just a couple. And it is more of this I sense of like not wanting to be like their fathers and just take an office job, wear a suit and the fedora. These are young men that want to be culturally expressive and just kind of check out and, hit the road, like Kerouac's famous book said. So that's going on, and below the surface, you have the civil rights movement really getting going. Already back in '46, you had Mendez versus Westminster. So I mean, that's not too far out from where we all live. To challenge school segregation there. This is Mexican American segregation that is potentially happening, and so that gets knocked down. And then a few years later, Brown versus Board of Education is happens, and that ends school segregation, and you start to see the breakdown of segregation education in the South, and that's kind of the first domino to fall with regards to the Jim Crow segregation in the South. So the other thing is you do get the beginning of adolescent culture in the U.S., birth of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. You can watch the video to the left. And so, you have this, again, very kind of American style music pop up. And it's very much geared, the movies, the kind of these anti-hero characters, these kind of rebel without a cause character like James Dean. They really start to get marketed towards the youth culture. Then speaking of the Cold War, things kind of go off the rails. The Cuba will fall under these guerrillas led by Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, and the Argentine Che Guevara. This revolution that didn't look like could possibly happen does. The unpopular leader Batista is dunked, and Castro takes over, and Castro basically will align himself with the Soviet Union. So now, for all this fear about containment in Asia, now you have, a nation just very not too far south of, Florida, become communist. And so this drags the United States to get way more involved in Latin American affairs. And so, not too long before that, you had the coup against Arbenz in Guatemala. And then you also had more pushback against Latino groups with Operation Wetback. Yes, that is actually what it's named in the 1950s, where you get this massive deportation of Mexican immigrants. Because the Bracero program that was going on since World War II had been continuing, pretty much in some ways almost ignored because of the war effort, and then you start to get bigger pushback with Operation Wetback, and then even in the later '60s, where you will see some new legislation happen with regards to immigration. So that's something we'll probably see coming up. All right, so civil rights movement, in some ways, this is, within U.S. history, it gets spoken about a lot. It begins, we already saw with education was one thing, and then it's continued with the bus boycotts because of Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus into the segregated section. So this is where Dr. King really becomes a nationwide, public figure. It's also a time period during the probably the most glamorized first family in the White House. That's John F. Kennedy and his wife. I mentioned Kennedy was a Cold War hawk. He was trying to get Castro out of Cuba and failed. That's a Bay of Pigs failure. But the Cuban Missile Crisis, was kind of the closest that the United States came to war with Soviet Union. Soviet Union was placing missiles there, and the United States refused to budge on not wanting them there, and so Soviet Union would eventually pull the weapons. But then Kennedy, young, youthful Kennedy is shot, and that really does rock the nation and open